Okay, back again. I taught my last class yesterday, so I have a little bit more discretionary time on my hands than I've had in a while. Last time I checked Graham Hancock's video, he's got 2.1 million views now, so I'm right there. I'm going to catch up. So what I wanted to talk about today is Graham Hancock's conception of what science is, whether archaeology qualifies as a science or not, how science is done, and that sort of thing. I think this stuff is really important and it's really interesting because it gets to the crux of how we separate science from pseudoscience, how we can arrive at explanations which have some kind of credibility, which resonate with the available evidence, and so on and so forth. And it cuts to the matter of whether or not what we do as archaeologists, or really any social science, or really other branches of the sciences that kind of confront the same basket of problems that we do, whether we can call ourselves scientists or not. So first, I want to play a little bit about what he says is the definition of science.
Well, it's fascinating to me that the geneticists would rely on the archaeologists, being that the geneticists have the actual DNA that they can examine, where the archaeologists are piecing things together.
Yeah,
little tiny bits of information over the entire landscape, and then you consider how much information they don't have access to that's in the ground.
Exactly.
There's so much.
I strongly resist the idea that archaeology is a science. I don't think it should be described as a science.
What do you think it should be described as?
It's more like a kind of philosophy. It's an attempt to interpret the past based on rather flimsy and limited evidence. And what you find in that interpretation is that the preconceptions of the individuals involved are being imposed upon the evidence, which then turns out to support their preconceptions. And that's not a scientific way of doing things. A scientific way of doing things is testing hypotheses and seeking to falsify them and seeing if they work out.
So the problem is drawing these conclusions and then being too rigid with these conclusions on the further evidence.
That's my view.
Yeah.
That archaeology has been much too rigid, and that there's a climate of fear in archaeology. I don't mean to pick particularly on archaeologists here. I think this is generally true across other disciplines as well.
All right, let me stop you right there. What a hot mess that was. So in a lot of ways, I agree. He gave kind of a classical definition of what science is. You know, you come up with a hypothesis, you test it, you attempt to falsify it. He accuses archaeology. I'm not sure whether he accuses us of not doing that or being unable to do that. There is a difference. The irony, though, in Graham Hancock saying that we don't work hard enough to, come up with ideas and then try to falsify them is what do you even call that? Let me show you a diagram that I use in my classes to try to explain how archaeology works as a science. So this is a diagram showing how I conceive of the way science works, and I think that you will find a lot of other scientists who would agree with this. There's a loop that you go in. It's got two sides to it. There's an inductive side and there's a deductive side. Induction is when you craft an explanation based on a bunch of observations, pieces of data. In archaeology, they could be pieces of material culture, a bunch of pieces of pottery or stone tools or something like that. You've got all this stuff sitting there in front of you that you have collected. You're going to create a story that is going to explain the variation in those or what they mean. That's an explanation. So you can go from data to a general idea or explanation. That general idea might be correct, or it might be wrong. The trick is that you have to have some way to know whether your general idea is correct or wrong. So you need to go on the deductive side. You can take your general idea and say, if I am correct, I have then X, Y, and Z are true. So you can take your general idea and develop expectations that you can then compare to new data through observation. That's the deductive side. Example, say you've got a bunch of pottery that's collected from prehistoric sites associated with some kind of, complex social system. You can look at all this pottery and go, well, there's 3 different sizes of vessels here. I think that the large vessels are for serving. They were used for communal feasting and so on. The vessels that are smaller were used to prepare foods individually over fires. And then the medium-sized vessels were used for storage. So that's my general explanation of the variability in those vessels. In order to see whether I'm right or not, I go, well, if these vessels were used for feasting, the large vessels, then I should find those more often in contexts that suggest that that was their function. I should be able to go directly to the archaeological record, and I should be able to unearth middens associated with times and places where we would expect communal feasting activities to have taken place, and I should find evidence that those vessels were indeed used there. Or I could get food residue from them and check that. I should find storage vessels in different kinds of contexts, and I should find these food preparation vessels, again, in different kinds of contexts. I can make kind of a series of expectations based on my general idea, and then I can test it. If I find out that some of my idea is wrong, or maybe all of it is wrong, I can incorporate my new observations, and then I can induce a brand new idea. The thing is that once you're in this loop, you are doing science. You are embracing a way to falsify on this side parts of these narratives and keep winnowing out ideas that are wrong, that are not correct, that can be shown to be wrong. When you're in this loop, you're doing science. I don't care where you enter the loop. I don't care whether you start with a general idea or whether you start with some kind of falsification of a previous idea or whatever. I don't care whether you're passed out on the couch at 2 o'clock in the morning and you have a great idea. If you can get in this loop and determine whether that idea is false or not, you're doing science. This loop of induction and deduction is common to a lot of different scientific pursuits. One of the things that makes archaeology particularly challenging is that we are trying to understand things that happened in the past that we can no longer directly observe. If you're doing experiments in the lab and you can control all the conditions, this is a lot less complicated than it is if you're trying to understand human behavior, which is complicated enough to begin with, but you're trying to understand it in the past. You can't actually directly observe it. We have to observe artifacts and their context and their provenience and things like that in order to create a story about human behavior that we can then go back and test with additional data. We are still in this loop. All right, I'm going to fast forward a little bit to about hour 56:30 into it. He's going to talk a little bit more about stuff that's relevant to understanding the nature of science.
Side isn't just wishy-washy stuff out there on the fringes of things, that there are those of us working in this field who are using really solid information and who our project is to rewrite history. And
the solid information they're using is other people's solid information. All the stuff about the Younger Dryas and climate science and that sort of thing, that's all being done by real scientists. There's always a little bit of a sleight of hand going on here. You can lean on the fact that he is incorporating solid information into his narrative. That does not make it true that the other parts of his story that he is kind of hanging on that skeleton of solid information are also true. There was climate change, significant climate change associated with the Younger Dryas. There's still quite a bit of controversy whether it was an impact or not. Reasonable people can disagree on that. But we know that the climate did change for some reason. And we know that human societies would have had to react to that climate change and adapt to it somehow. Just because there was a sudden and prolonged climate change, again, causes put off to the side, does not mean that there was a civilization there for that climate change to affect. Continuing.
We're not going to do that with slight information. It has to be solid information. I think we have.
So he wants the solid information. He wants the good stuff, which is what we all want. Nobody wants to build a story build a building based on a foundation that is very, very crumbly. You want to have the solid parts of it down before you hang all of these other things on that. Which is why it's surprising and disappointing how he chastises archaeologists for being skeptical of ideas that seem to run contrary to all of the other accepted evidence, as if we are supposed to just embrace these fantastical claims from the outset and not look at them and go, wait a minute, if that's true, then this should be true, which is exactly what I and a lot of my colleagues did with the Cerruti Mastodon find. It may be that the Cerruti Mastodon turns out to be legitimate. However, there are legitimate questions that one can raise. Why are there no cut marks? If the bones were green, how did the meat get off the bones? If it was taken off by humans, you would expect to find some cut marks. If it was removed by carnivores, you would expect to find some carnivore gnawing. Neither of those things is there. So that kind of questioning of a kind of specific site or set of interpretations, like that's what you do. If this is true, then we would expect this, and if not, then why not? The funny thing about humans and human behavior, and we're lucky in this regard, every archaeological site is unique, but human behavior is patterned. Humans do the same damn thing over and over and over again, and that's why we can learn about their behavior without knowing every single, without having direct evidence of every single thing that every single human did in the past, because we act in patterned ways. We can get a sample of those behaviors, and through the various things that we do in archaeology to draw out plausible interpretations of human behavior, we can get at those patterns without being able to get at the particular. This is one of the reasons why the crime scene analogy is a bad one for archaeology. We are not CSI. We are not reconstructing the past in such a minute detail that we could convict somebody of doing a certain thing at a certain time. It just doesn't work that way. It would be great if it did, and sometimes you can get at kind of very small fragments of time and have some very high resolution ideas or interpretations about things that happen on very small scales of time and very limited scales of space. But most of the time we're looking at larger patterns. We're looking at patterns of material residues that are left behind over weeks, months, years, even generations. That's the stuff of archaeology, that going from those statics that are there to try to get at the dynamics of human behavior. Let's keep going.
Which I appreciated. I'd like to see much more engagement and much more positive approach. I wish the skeptics, welcome to their skepticism, but I wish they'd be less hateful, less full of derision, less despising.
Well, they're so defensive with their ideas,
and so defensive with their ideas when the possibility is there for a constructive debate.
Well, what's interesting to me is that as this evidence piles up, and it seems to be continuing to pile up as more like these impact sites and more of this ancient civilization material gets unearthed, it's almost insurmountable.
Yeah, it's almost, and this is how paradigms shift. I mean, everybody's familiar with the concept of a paradigm shift, and there's a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, which outlines what a paradigm shift is, where an established model in some discipline of science that has been in control of people's thinking for a very long time suddenly falls apart. And it doesn't fall apart suddenly. What happens is that there's an accumulation of evidence which that model cannot explain.
I think that's true sometimes and not true other times. There's this axiom that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I have written before, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. Ordinary evidence works pretty well a lot of the time, and this idea that it takes this massive accumulation of contrary evidence that can't be explained, and then all of a sudden the paradigm shift happens. If you can look at a couple cases of archaeology in the Americas that I don't think fit that model at all. One is the Clovis First stuff again. It wasn't necessarily a mountain of evidence about pre-Clovis occupations that I think showed that model was false. All it took was one good site, and that site was Monteverde. They flew people down there on a plane in 1997, and they said, yeah, it's that old, and it's a human site. That's it. It wasn't the fact that there were, 10,000 purported pre-Clovis sites found. People say, well, they can't all be wrong. That's not the way archaeologists think most of the time. Another good example is the site of L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. This idea that the Norse had visited ancient North America. All of this stuff with, the Kensington runestone and other stones and inscriptions and Norse artifacts found in Minnesota and all that doesn't amount to a hill of beans. What was required was one good site, a site that had context that we could look at and say, yeah, those are Norse houses. Yeah, those are Norse spindle wheels. Yeah, this is a Norse occupation. It dates to this time period. It's the real deal. That's it. A lot of the challenge is phrasing your hypotheses in a way that they can actually be falsified and tested. You cannot prove a negative. So we haven't found Atlantis yet, correct? You can find, if you do a search for locations of Atlantis, you can find dozens and dozens of locations around the world that have been proposed to be that of Atlantis. The argument from that side, the people who really want there to be an Atlantis, is going to be, well, it exists, we just haven't found it yet. I will never be able to prove to your satisfaction that Atlantis doesn't exist, because you'll just tell me that it's someplace where we haven't looked yet. In order to make that a falsifiable hypothesis, you have to phrase it in a different way. You have to say that my default is that Atlantis does not exist, and therefore it is your burden to prove that it does. You need to find it. You need to show me positive evidence that your claim is true. With the Norse occupation of North America, I can never prove to you that Vikings didn't make it to Minnesota. My default hypothesis as a scientist has got to be that Vikings did not make it to Minnesota, because then you can actually falsify that hypothesis with positive evidence that they did. That is a scientific way of thinking about things. That gets us into this loop. If you stay on this induction side, you can take whatever facts and evidence that you like, you can incorporate it all, and you can create a story of your Ice Age civilization up here. If you are never on this deductive side, where you are throwing some of those things out that we know to be false, that we know are not correct, you're never going to produce an idea that actually matches reality. Archaeologists are in this loop, and that's why I would argue, and I would argue strongly, that we are doing science. We're doing science in the same way that geologists do science. They cannot observe the past directly either. They can take conditions in the present, and through a series of theory building and hypothesis testing, you can come up with a story about the geological past that you can have some degree of comfort is actually credible. And so this idea that you can keep adding to the mountain of evidence for a lost Ice Age civilization, and eventually you're going to get to a tipping point. People are going to go, yeah, it's probably true. That's nonsense. What you need is one human-made structure, and I'm not talking about the Bimini Road or Yonaguni or all this other stuff that's natural. You need one human-made thing that's in deposits of the right age, that would have to have been from that time period, that is an unquestionable, easily understood human construction. That is all that you need. That is it. That will suffice. You do not need a mountain of stuff of claiming that the Baghdad battery was evidence of high technology, or there are things in Egypt that we couldn't do with a crane today, and all these things don't amount to anything. They don't amount to anything. And if you were really trying to do the science, you would go out and look for new evidence in the places where you say it should be, and deposits of the time period where you say it should exist. You would find that evidence and you would put it forward. You would not be scooping up and cherry picking from things that other scientists do and trying to make them fit your preconceived narrative. And this is the high irony of accusing archaeologists of the ones who have a narrative, and if things don't fit, we throw it out. We go through a process of trying to see which pieces of quote-unquote evidence are trustworthy and that we can, build a credible story around, and which ones we can't. And if you can't build a credible story around it, if you don't trust it, if you don't believe the story of where this artifact came from or something, you gotta throw it out. You have to. You can't make a good tomato soup if you let the rotten tomatoes keep stewing around in there. If you want to get to the correct story, you have to be willing to discard pieces, and not because they don't fit your story, but because they're not good evidence. You have to be able to winnow those out. And it doesn't matter how many bad tomatoes you throw on the tomato pile, you're not going to make a good tomato soup out of that stuff. Ultimately, your story is not going to be the correct one. So if you want to hang your hat on the idea that advanced geometrical knowledge was necessary, to do this, which I did in 2 minutes yesterday, if that's your evidence, then I don't believe your story, because that's not good evidence. That's a misrepresentation of what is actually out there. I believe that you're just picking the quote-unquote facts that you want to have as facts to build a story around because they fit. That's not how you're going to get to the correct story. It may convince a lot of people who watch these kinds of podcasts who don't necessarily understand how archaeology, how the science of the past, of the human past is done. That's partially our fault for not being better at explaining it. But it's not going to convince people who pay attention. It never will, and it's not because we're biased, it's because we have a process for figuring out how to know whether a story is right or wrong. And that's a scientific process. We are in that loop. If you're not in that loop with us, I'm sorry if it hurts your feelings to be called a pseudoscientist, but that's what you're doing, is pseudoscience. You're pretending to be in that loop. You're pretending to put all of those elements together, but you're not interested in testing the story and finding out which parts are right and which parts are wrong. You're not interested in kind of generating data from new insights. You're not interested in incorporating things that don't fit into the narrative. It is because archaeologists are most of the time operating in a scientific framework that we know more about the human past than we used to. And that will continue. And the claim that there's a mountain of evidence building up that everything that we know about history is wrong is total nonsense. Total nonsense. If you were in this loop, you would understand that. But most of these pseudoscientific endeavors are focused over here. There's no mechanism for throwing out stuff that's bad. This is why you see a lot of the transoceanic contact arguments still revolving around artifacts, from the Victorian period that we know are hoaxes, and they've been demonstrated to be fraudulent artifacts, bad pieces of evidence over and over and over again. But because nobody is operating over here on this side, they're still incorporating those into these general ideas. And if you have no mechanism for throwing stuff out and all you got are a bunch of rotten tomatoes swishing around in your blender there, you're more than welcome to eat what comes out of that, but I'm going to pass. Thank you.